So what's the author talking about as far as the origin of the word church? There are many people that make a big to-do about the word church never shows up in the Bible. We have to remember that the scripture as it is now, the Holy Bible as it is now, is not written in its earliest form, in earliest language. The Septuagint, for instance, was the Greek translation of the Hebrew, and there's a lot of the Old Testament that was in Hebrew and translated to Koine Greek, and Greek tends to be as part of the if you will, the international language of the time, tends to be the overarching language, the original language of Scripture in many, many portions of it. So we need to go back to the Greek. And as we look at the Greek, there are many forms of what we would call the word church. As he points out, there are the cognate forms, which is kirch, kerche, kirk, and they're all versions or variations and come from the root adjective of the Greek, kerikon. The New Testament word translated is ecclesia, and ecclesia is used of a public assembly, and usually summoned by a herald, someone of authority that would say, gather round, gather in, gather in. And as they would gather round and gather in, it made that assembly legal. And that was something that was very important in the early times of the New Testament church. And so there is a point to this. And the point, as he points out, as the author points out, we can find that very quickly in Acts, starting in Acts 19, starting in verse 32. Verse 32 says, some were shouting one thing and some another, because the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. It goes on and it talks about what was going on within that. It also, in the context of this, it is pointing them to an assembly with discipline. And then it goes on in verse 39. It says, but if you seek anything further, it must be decided in a legal assembly. And then 40, in fact, we run a risk of being charged with rioting for what happened today, since there is no justification that we can give as a reason for this disturbance. And so that is why the church, as it were, is called to order. That's why in the tradition of the church, we have at the very beginning of the onset of the service, we have the call to worship, which traditionally is done by the deacon or an elder or the pastor of the church. And the call to worship is a call to the assembly to come in an orderly fashion and let us prepare ourselves for worship. That's where it has its context, and that's where it has its origin.